Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Geek Warning podcast. I'm Dave Rome and I'm not your host for this episode. Rather, Ronan McLaughlin is. And Ronan, what have you got for us?
We've got a recording that I did with Rob Gitelis of Factor Bikes back in January at the Tour Down Under in Adelaide. And specifically, we're jumping into the question and providing dollar figures for why premium carbon road bikes have got so expensive in the past couple of years. So Rob and I, we touch on basically everything that goes into the cost of producing the bikes that we're buying today and the reasons why the prices we're paying for those bikes are seemingly escalating year on year.
It's a topic we've been talking about a lot internally over, I'd say, since our inception. I think this is one of the articles or one of the podcasts we discussed doing at our start, and it was deemed the sort of topic that we'd never get the required information on in order to do it. So well done on pulling this off, and I guess let's not keep it any longer. Should we just jump straight into it?
I think we'll jump in. You and I will pick it up after the interview with Rob is finished. But in the meantime, let's hear what Rob has to say.
Great.
I'm joined for this episode by Rob Gitelis, who is CEO of Factor Bikes and Black Ink Wheels, not to mention the guy who ran much of the carbon frame manufacturing industry at one point before diverting his sole attention to Factor Bikes, and as such is perfectly positioned to answer this question. Welcome to the podcast, Rob. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. Before we delve into this podcast and answer that question, I think it's worth, first of all, just explaining that, Rob, you've agreed to join us on the show kind of off the back of me springing this question on you in the Expo Centre here at the Tour Down Under in Adelaide just a few days ago. Following that, myself and Dave Rome had a sort of initial exploratory meeting with you, and we went through quite a fascinating conversation with yourself, and you broke down some of what does go into making bicycles, some of the costs associated with it that I certainly was not aware of, some of the costs that I was aware of, and how those combine, and what the different how they come together to make the bikes the prices that they are these days. But what is also worth mentioning is that obviously you represent Factor Bikes. The insight that you're about to give us is a perspective of one sort of premium brand. The structures in that we're about to speak of might not apply elsewhere in the industry, and so that's I think that's worth delving into first of all.
Sure, I think a lot of it is applicable across the entire bike industry. Okay. I think the main difference is that Factor owns its own factories, while most other brands work with third-party manufacturers.
Okay, is there a difference in the fact that you're not entirely, but mostly consumer direct now? And
in fact, that's not correct. We're only direct in a couple of markets, and in those markets we're multi-channel. We're not exclusively consumer direct.
Okay, well, I was sort of thinking that perhaps there might have been a scale thing there, that if you are direct to consumer direct, that might have influenced what we're about to talk about.
Well, you would think it would, except then we saw Canyon's numbers this past year, and they weren't all that great.
Okay. I guess in the next question off the back of that then is how big is Factor now?
Factor this year is about 10,000 bicycles.
Okay. So in the grand scheme of things, for listeners who might not be aware, are there manufacturers doing less bikes? Are there manufacturers doing 1 million bikes? How does that stand?
Well, I think, manufacturers versus brands. I think if we look at brands, Factor's still fairly small compared to, a specialized Trek giant, Cannondale. But, catching up to Pinarello, a bit bigger than many of the other premium bike makers that are, you would see underneath us.
Is some of that difference in the fact that you've got a new Ostro coming? We've seen it here. It replaces the existing Ostro. That Ostro doesn't become like a second-tier model. There is no second-tier Factor. It's
no, at Factor we only offer premium level bikes. We are either Ultegra, Durace, Force Red, XX1. We don't go down from there.
Well, and guess good question to kick it off then. Why are bikes so expensive? Simple one.
Well, I think that, if we look at why are bikes so expensive, I think that there's a lot of really good analogies. And if we look at what a bike cost 25 years ago to what it costs today, I think if we, factor in inflation and everything, bikes cost roughly the same that they cost 25 years ago. Just everything costs more. And, but if we look at the absolute numbers, a bicycle was $3,000 20 years ago for, a premium level bike. And if you extrapolate that across 20 years, a $10,000 bike is not all that outrageous if we compare to every other product that's out in the marketplace.
You think that's, have you looked into that, or you think that's, it's sort of not what we tend to hear. A lot of people would assume that bike prices haven't really tracked with inflation.
I think that the value of what you get out of a bike is a lot more. I don't think that if we just took inflation, we're certainly not selling the same bike that we were 20 years ago. Bikes 20 years ago, they had 10 speeds, they were friction shifting, and, now they're carbon fiber, they're electronic, they're, quite a bit lighter, quite a bit stiffer. So things have changed quite a bit. And I think the value you get today, if we compared, 20 years ago to that $3,000 bike, is actually far greater.
Yeah, I can see that, and certainly some of the development work, which is an area we're going to touch on later in the podcast. It's visible. You look at a bike from 20, 30 years ago, it's mostly round tubes and friction shifters and whatnot. Compare that to today, it's vastly different. One thing I do want to ask you though is, it seems like the prices sort of went. I'm mostly talking about the entire industry here, but it seems like the prices went through the roof when COVID hit. Was there some sort of COVID boom greed effect, or?
I think there was obviously a pretty big bicycle shortage during COVID. So if you had bicycles for sale, you definitely did not need to be discounting them. I think there was some other factors at play, as we all heard about. Shipping containers almost didn't exist. So every bicycle that we shipped over a 2-year period of time was shipping by DHL. And so, it costs about $25 to $30 per bicycle to put it in a container and ship it across the ocean. If you're shipping by DHL, it's nearly $500 per bicycle to ship it across the ocean from Taiwan, where our bikes are made, to North America or Europe. So, that was already a very significant cost. And then, as we know, there was, other issues of material shortages, parts shortages. So you were basically, we as a brand, were paying a premium on everything that we then, on-sold.
Is there any indication that those costs that you're effectively, forced to pass on are normalizing again?
We can see that shipping costs have come down over the last year. Definitely now, sea shipping is available, although I hear that there's becoming a lot of trouble in the Suez Canal, I think, is what I've been reading. So, shipping to Europe is still a bit of a challenge, but certainly now we are able to get back to shipping bicycles, through container shipments by sea.
You mentioned their demand. Obviously, pricing reflects supply and demand quite closely. As COVID hit, most manufacturers cut off their manufacturing. Then the demand went through the roof, and as such, there was no product available. Has all that normalized again? We're effectively 4 years on from that point now. I think
we're going to see this sort of a whiplash effect yet again. I think right now there's a lot of inventory available, so most of the incumbent brands have kind of reduced their forecasts for 2024. We're about to break for Chinese New Year. Normally what happens is factories, they, let their workers know, do you have a job coming back after Chinese New Year? And they staff according to what they believe the demand will be for 2024. I believe most manufacturers or most brands have really cut back their forecasts. And so a lot of the factories then are going to come back with a far reduced capacity from what they had in 23 and 22. And, I think that we could end up in the same situation again towards the end of 2024. If there becomes a strong demand for bikes again, the factories simply won't have the manpower to be able to ramp up to meet the demand. Generally, you only have one opportunity per year to hire in China, and that's directly after Chinese New Year. Generally, people, they take a contract for a year, and it's very difficult to hire, outside of that window.
If I'm reading what you're saying right there, we're sort of, the cycling industry is in either constant feast or famine mode. It's There's no real steady, even keel of manufacturing.
Well, I think there always was. I think that we were, as an industry, it was growing at a somewhat healthy rate. I think we could always sort of look to Shimano as sort of like the indicator, and Shimano was always growing 3, 4, 5% per year, which, you know, for an entire industry is a fairly healthy amount. What happened during COVID was obviously a huge anomaly. I think we're back to pretty much, you know, those pre-COVID numbers. I think the problem is too many people got used to this crazy time of COVID of, you know, making money hand over fist in many cases. And now they're like all complaining, oh, business is so poor. I'm like, I always ask them, is it the same as 2019? And they're like, no, it's a little better than 2019. I'm like, great, then you really shouldn't be complaining that much about it.
How then should we have tackled that period, do you think?
Well, we've never gone through a global pandemic before. So it's really hard to say. But I think our industry is known for taking very knee-jerk reactions because, you know, from one extreme to the other, now we have this oversupply issue with a lot of inventory in the market because people, you know, they couldn't really judge when the demand was going to slow and when they should probably decide to cut back, and they all continue to think, you know, really positively, really bullishly, and then they all got caught out with quite a bit of inventory because it was all so delayed and got delivered so late.
The other thing you mentioned there was the staffing and staffing opportunities and hiring just after Chinese New Year. A word that you had used, or a phrase that you had used in our meeting a couple of days ago, was a transient workforce.
Yeah, I can't speak so much for Southeast Asia because a lot of manufacturing has moved to Cambodia, Vietnam. But I can speak for Taiwan, which is a normalized workforce, but China is very much a transient workforce. So most of your workers in China are coming to what we call it the Pearl Delta, which is the southern part of China, but most of them are from the north, you know, as many as, 2 to 3 day train ride away. And so, a lot of the workers, they're not local to the communities and they're just coming, for that job. They're trained, to do that task, but they're very open to just moving to another factory to do a different task based off of, if it pays a few dollars more per hour, then that's what they're going to do. And so it does make it a bit challenging that if you haven't, rehired your already trained workers, that you are going to end up having to train again at a later time.
Surely there's some sort of efficiency cost there.
To make an entry-level frame, it probably takes 2 to 3 weeks of training to get, a worker to be, have some level of competence where they could be working alongside someone. Obviously, making a very, premium level, a 700-gram frame or something like that, that's a better part of 6 months of training and really, a certain level of efficiencies and being able to qualify them to be able to make, that sort of frame. And so, yes, it really does become a true cost of having, if you have a high turnover of employees at your factory, that becomes a significant cost.
At least, my understanding has always been that Taiwan, for example, I want my carbon frame built there because that's where the expertise is. But what you're sort of saying to me now is that actually, if I read into that, it tells me the workforce is ever changing and the opportunity to build expertise isn't necessarily there.
Well, no, Taiwan is something very different. I find it a little bit interesting. So many bikes, they say made in Taiwan. But if we look at actual carbon fiber manufacturing, I think there's just about 2 or 3 factories that are actually producing frames in carbon fiber in Taiwan. There's probably, 150 in China. And then, as I said earlier, they're in Vietnam, Cambodia, other parts of Southeast Asia. So a lot of times, when people are talking about, oh, my frame is made in Taiwan, it's probably not true.
Okay. I wanted to touch on staff there first, sort of people first. It's presumably one of the biggest recurring costs in terms of owning and running a factory. If we delve into the factory a bit further, how much does it cost to make a premium carbon fiber bike frame?
Well, I think we can look at, most brands are working with third-party manufacturers. So, those are factories that are making carbon fiber frames, forks, wheels, handlebars for, many different brands. If we look at, the top tier industry or the top tier players,
Can we say like top 5?
top, again, if we're going back to Giant produces their own frames in their own factory in China. But if we look at Cannondale, Specialized, Trek, Pinarello, as an example, they're all working with third-party manufacturers in China. They're not working in the same factory. There are about 5 or 6 of these really top-level factories that produce the top-level brands. And then there's the next-level factories down, which produce sort of like the next-level brands. There's nothing to say the second-level factory is any different than the first-level factory. It's just the size and the capacity of it.
Can you put a dollar figure for me on manufacturing a frame?
Well, it's fairly complicated, but at the manufacturing side, so, if we just look at a third-party manufacturer, they're providing, a single, it's called an FOB price onto a frame.
FOB meaning?
FOB it means free on boat. Okay. So what it means is that the brand will actually, they will have a designated shipping company that they will tell the factory to get in touch with. Factory will then work with that shipping company to get the frames all the way to that shipping yard. And at that point, the factory their job is done. And then it's up to the brand to take over from there, all of the costs from that point forward. Okay. And so if we look at a manufacturing cost of a frame, there's essentially material cost, overhead, labor. Those are the 3, main pillars. And so if we look at, the cost of making a premium level frame versus a more entry level frame, it's nearly identical as far as the labor cost goes, but obviously the material is different. And overhead is a percentage of, it's a calculation put on the other 2. And so obviously if material cost is higher, then overhead is also higher. And usually we found, it's been a while since I did contract manufacturing, but it was almost like a third of, the way those 3 things would work out to be the sort of the cost, the finished FOB cost of a frame.
You often hear these random figures bandied about. Oh, they make these frames for $100. Is that accurate?
No, I think if we look at, and prior to this meeting, I did a little bit of research in my own costs. And so if we look at, our Ostro, the material cost of just the carbon fiber material is $330 US. Then the preform, so it's EPS styrofoam dipped in latex. That's another $35 US. So those are the 2 main material costs. So obviously that's nearly $400, and we haven't even gone into the mold yet. And so $100 frame is pretty far from accurate.
Okay, you mentioned molds there. I've heard everything from $20,000 to $100,000 quoted for molds.
I think if we look at a good quality mold and sort of a more complex shape, so something like an Aero road bike, I think for 6, 7 sizes, you're looking at about $100,000 to $130,000 US of mold cost to produce, those 7 sizes, 6 or 7 sizes of frames.
And to be clear, that's a mold for each size.
That's a mold for each size, and then you'll have perhaps some shared molds of, chain stays, seat stays. As bikes have become more complex, like in the case of Factor, we nearly have 1 fork with 1 frame. Not quite. I think we offer 4 forks over 7 sizes of frames. So that would mean that we also have 4 fork molds. It used to be in the past that you would have 2 fork molds, a 43 and a 53, to cover all of your sizes. But as we've learned more about trail and how important that is, in the handling of a bike, you realize that you need to start to have more offsets of forks.
So the figure you quoted there, was that including the fork mold?
That's not including the fork mold. So that was just the frames actually. And then the fork mold is about $6,000 US per fork.
Per fork.
Yeah.
So that's
it adds up pretty quick. Yeah. So I think if we look at it, I calculate it normally about $150,000 US to develop in mold costs as part of the development fee.
Looking on elsewhere around the factory floor, can you put a number on like QC, quality control, rejects?
I think that normally you try to run your factory with, less than 5% scrap rate. And so anything more than that, it becomes fundamentally, there's a fundamental problem inside of your facility. But I think, when we talk about scrap rate, it's also the scrap at when you're cutting your carbon fiber material. Obviously, if you're cutting more complex shapes, then you're left with a lot of scrap carbon material, which can't be used, which unfortunately ends up in the bin. And then, as you're going through the production, you could have a blown air bladder, you could, something out of alignment, there's various things that could happen that would cause you to have to scrap the product midway.
Is there destructive testing? Does that add any cost to?
We consider that part of the development costs of developing a bike. So in the process of developing a bike, you could end up making as many as 100 samples when you start to think about all of the iterations. When you're trying to achieve certain stiffness goals, certain weight goals, as smart as we think we are, there's still an awful lot of trial and error going on. And so, it's a lot of little changes to, between iterations, and then every one of those frames ends up being broken. So, if you think about it, if you're breaking 100 frames in order to get to the final rev, that's a cost we consider that part of the development cost. If we look at QC, that fallout, that's pretty much part of your overhead as part of your factory manufacturing cost.
Those factory and manufacturing costs, development, staff even that we spoke about earlier, are you associating them with a per frame cost, or does each frame have to sort of cover its own costs in that space, or is that a company-wide cost, or how does that work?
That's a good question, because I think if we look at the contract manufacturers and say you're working for a brand, say you're working for Cervelo, and Cervelo has some models which they sell quite a few of. And then they have some models that they sell very few of compared to their more popular models. I think that as a factory, you accept that, okay, this is going to be a very, profitable for the factory, and, that it will cover all of its costs. And then you look at those other models as, well, I'm supporting this brand because they're giving me, this one model, which is very popular. So then I need to then also support them on this less popular model. Maybe they need less than 1,000 per year. And so, on something like that, if it's less than 1,000 per year, it's quite possible that you're just breaking even when you start to look at your development costs and everything else.
All right, folks, interrupting this interview for a second just to say that this entire episode is free to anyone to listen to, Escape Collective members and the wider public. If you are a member of the wider public and you're not yet a member of Escape Collective, then you have a job to do. And that is to share this with someone else who is not yet a member. And please also consider becoming a member, because it's only thanks to our membership that any of the Escape Collective content that we produce happens. So this podcast you're listening to only happened because other people signed up to escapecollective.com. So if you could do that, that means more like this can happen. And you can do that by visiting escapecollective.com/join now. And there are various options that are, we think, especially good value for money. You can pay monthly or annually. So
I agree.
Go do it. All right, back to the interview. The Austro you mentioned, there's obviously a premium aero road offering. I think that's especially where people are seeing prices creeping up and thinking, what's going on here?
Well, I like to say, I'm happy to say that in our case, the Austro, between iterations, we're actually keeping the same price. We're not actually raising the price. But I think that, it is one of our premium level road bikes, for sure. And when we look at the ultimate costs, so, what we discussed was sort of the manufacturing costs. But then we need to then start to discuss engineering and all those other things that go into running a brand. Because again, if you're just working, with a third party manufacturer, that's just one step of, okay, here's my drawings, give me back a frame that you bought. But that's only, a very small portion of the actual cost that goes into developing the bike.
Well, I totally understand where you're coming from with the $400 frame cost and how that can then creep up from there. At least my understanding before this conversation was that actually research and development is probably one of the biggest cost centers. Would that be accurate?
I think that when you look at, your R&D, especially if you're a smaller brand that's only making, a few different products every year, that R&D can become, a significant cost. If it's pretty easy to understand that, if we're producing 10,000 frames per year, if our R&D budget's $1 million, it's pretty easy math to figure out, well, $100 of every frame is going back to R&D. In our case, the more product you develop with that same R&D team, obviously that gets spread across more products, and it lowers your actual R&D costs. So, if you are a brand that, is making, kids bikes and mountain bikes and trekking bikes and all those other things, you obviously have a very large R&D department to support that. If we look at, a brand like Factor, our R&D department, we have around 5 engineers that are split between Canada and Taiwan, and then some designers as well. And so, when we had to divide that cost over, only a couple of bikes per year of development, it does become a pretty critical part of the cost of development.
Yeah, and how do you then manage that with, the premium offerings that you have? What does that development process look like, and can you attribute a cost per frame?
Well, in our case, we sit down and we have a product roadmap. And obviously, aero is a really important part of our process. So if I look at, our development process starts with, 3D models that then go into CFD. And so CFD, we could spend, 3 to 5 months just doing the CFD development work, doing many iterations. So we'll have, one engineer who's running the CFD. We'll have another engineer who's actually doing the modeling. But that could go on for 3 to 5 months of, these iteration after iteration. Finally, once we're satisfied with our CFD results, we lock in the drawings. We make a rapid prototype, which in our case we use. We make those by CNC. We don't actually 3D print them. We then take it to a wind tunnel, where perhaps we had 2 or 3 different ideas that we got out of CFD. We go to the wind tunnel. We spend 1 to 2 days there. A day at the wind tunnel costs anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000 US. We're happy with the wind tunnel results.
How many days per frame do you think you're in the wind tunnel?
I'd say this last year we went to the wind tunnel 4 times.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you. 6 days. Okay. Yeah. And so I couldn't tell you exactly, per frame, how much time in the wind tunnel, because sometimes we go in there with a couple of different models that we're running side by side, but you're definitely spending, $60,000 to $100,000 at the wind tunnel, to develop, 1 to 2 models. And then, from that point, you kind of lock in your drawings, and then you move them to the tooling development phase, which is then when you start to develop your molds, start to do all of these levels of iterations, and then move, to ride testing, as well as back to the wind tunnel to make sure that your final design matches your rapid prototype.
This sort of increase in bike prices directly correlates with an increased focus on improved aerodynamics. Is that by chance, or is that something to do with CFD and wind tunnels, or what's going on there?
I think that CFD is going to play a larger and larger role in some bike companies' design process, because in the past couple of years, we've been able to outsource the computing time, which has greatly lowered the actual computing cost of running the CFD. Obviously, you still need to have a very capable engineer who's doing the data crunching, but the actual computing cost, a couple of years ago could have run you $1 million a year. And now, with AWS, and Google, you can now outsource your computing time to them, and the costs have come down, to be roughly, $600-800 a month versus $1 million a year.
The other thing that's changed vastly in the past 20 years or so is just the sort of the types of carbon fiber used and different layups and all. How much development goes into that, and how much cost goes into that? Yeah,
when I was doing third-party manufacturing, I did that for the first 20 years of my working career in Taiwan. Very rarely did we use any sort of exotic materials. It was all fairly standard, you've all heard of, T700, T800. Those were basically the materials that we're using across, every frame that we made. Probably about 6 to 8 years ago, we were pushed pretty hard when Cervelo. Actually, it's more than that. When Cervelo produced it's called the RCA in California, they really showed that you could make a reliable frame that was quite a bit lighter. But, the materials they used were pretty exotic. They were using boron fibers, pitch fibers, pan fibers. And so that really, made us all, had to step up and then start to use those more exotic fibers. And so, when we look at, again, if we look at a factor, while there's $400 of just material costs there, a lot of bikes are still in that $200 range of, T700, T800. But to make a really, premium riding, very light, very strong bike, you definitely need to be using pan fiber, pitch fiber. And as well as, in our case, we use quite a bit of Textream. We don't use it as a cosmetic material. We actually use it on the innermost layers of our bikes. And so those things are all really kind of changed, where bicycles are at and how we've been able to achieve these weights that we have over the past few years.
Have we sort of leveled out in that development, or is that ongoing?
I think as far as the composite material goes, I think that we have almost reached the end, simply because you just need enough carbon fiber to prevent, sort of an oil canning effect that we see on, tubes where, you could easily make a bike that is perfectly strong enough to go ride. It will pass every ISO test, and you can break it with your thumbs. And and that's, not acceptable to be able to break it with your thumbs. So we're left adding more material to bikes now just because, we've gotten to these tube shapes that just really, need certain levels of reinforcement to prevent that buckling effect that in no way affects the ride quality or, as again, I was saying the performance, but, it's so thin now that, if you can break it with your thumbs, that's not a great place to be.
Well, presumably it does add, it might be minor, but it will add material costs and development costs and training costs.
I would say it's fairly minor. We're talking 40, 50 grams. But I think if we look at, where Factor is, where Specialized is, I don't really see us making frames that are going to get much lighter. Okay. I think that now, again, the focus is becoming more around aerodynamics and other integrations, I think, are going to become more important. But I think as far as where the material is, I don't think we can really reduce it much more. But I think aero-wise, there's still quite a long ways to go. We're definitely not even 70% of the way there yet.
Okay, so very, very difficult for me to bypass that statement. But in the interest of sticking to the topic that we are discussing here today, we might have to come back to that one in a follow-up podcast. What I want to get to is, of course, it's not just a frame that goes into building a bike. You've also got the finishing kit and components and everything goes into it. How much expense is added to, or how much cost is added to the final product from the likes of an OEM group set, let's say?
The price that we pay for group sets now is not that dissimilar from, almost the retail price. It's almost a pass through now.
Not dissimilar to retail or not dissimilar to trade?
No, sorry. Not retail, dealer price.
Okay.
Yeah, a bicycle dealer can buy a group set for nearly the same that we can buy a group set for now. And I don't think this is a bad thing at all. I think that, we should always earn money on those things that we create and not necessarily earn that much money on things that we simply buy and sell. Okay. So I look at, a group set as something that we buy and sell. Obviously a frame, a handlebar, a seat post, the forks, wheels, those are all things we create, and that's where, we should be focusing on earning our margin.
Is that why we've seen so many brands move into, like you've got Black Ink also, a components wing of a frame manufacturer?
I look at definitely components are a place to earn a little more margin, but I just feel that so many things now are proprietary or designed with. So whenever we design a new frame set, we always design a wheel set that goes with it. And it's not just a wheel set like, okay, here's a new wheel set. It's one that really is optimized in the wind tunnel together with the frame set to be, to work complementary with each other. We look at our handlebars the same way. And so I think that it's becoming a little too complicated to have to rely on a handlebar vendor per se to have a handlebar available that really matches, your design. Obviously not impossible. We can still see brands doing it, but it's just not our ethos.
It's probably worth mentioning at this point that obviously every business has a right to make a profit and hold your margins as you're mentioning there.
Mm-hmm.
Can you though give us a figure for wheel development, bar development, post development?
It might be worth just sort of backtracking and understanding where the end consumer prices end up.
Okay.
And I think that it's important to understand that, we are a brand that owns its own factory. So, we still buy our product from our factories, and then we on-sell them to distributors, who then on-sell them to dealers, who then on-sell them to customers. Our industry is, very... it's kind of almost a standardized, formula of around a 30% margin for a distributor, and around, between 30 and 40% for a dealer. And so, it's, I think Nike, they used to call it the 1-2-4 principle. They would buy it for 1, they would sell it for 2, and the next guy would sell it for 4. In many ways, our industry is, not that dissimilar.
Percentage is the same, but the numbers are bigger.
Yes. So if we look at, developing a wheel set, obviously doesn't cost quite the same as a frame set, but, you'd still have the same, mold cost. You still have the same CFD. You're still spending time in the wind tunnel. I would say, you're easily spending, $20,000 on developing, a rim profile that then becomes, a finished wheel. If we look at, brands like ourselves, or I think Envy, where, we're having, mixed shapes in the same wheel set. So our newest wheel is a 48 front, 58 rear. Well, that would almost mean that we'd have to extrapolate that price times 2.
Wow. What I also took from what you just said was actually it's the middleman, so to speak, for lack of a better term. And maybe I shouldn't use that term at all, but it's the distributor and the retailer who, absolutely need to make a profit also, and their businesses need to be sustainable. But that's just from what you just said. That seems to be where the big numbers are.
Well, I would say everyone is adding value in the chain. We couldn't sell bicycles without dealers. We couldn't sell bicycles without distributors. So nobody's just, a middleman. Everybody is adding value. What we sell the bicycle for is nowhere even close to the final retail price. And so I think a lot of times the brands take a lot of heat. Oh, the brand is making too much money. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily true. I think that everybody's earning a proper living in the side of the cycle. But there are, certain, things that are required, such as distribution and retail sales. When we look at direct to consumer, you would think that should be a more profitable business, but they have a lot of associated costs as well. They're delivering a bicycle which is ready to ride out of the box, which that requires basically having your own bicycle assembly factory to the level of a retailer. That's a pretty big cost. I'm definitely not saying that's the way to go, but I think that it's not as profitable per se as people think to forego the distributor and dealer.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning, I can't think of any local bike shops or distributors, especially in the UK scene right now, who are absolutely making a killing. Many of them are struggling right now, so...
I think that obviously we can see that there's a lot of discounting going on because, there's obviously too much inventory, and that's just going to take some time to work through the system. I think that, again, if we look at the bicycle industry, I look at our business as a little bit of an anomaly, because, we've been growing year after year because we're still a young brand and we're still, pushing it very hard. But I think that, the key number is, where were we in 2019? Where are we today? Are we in a better place than we were in 2019? I think the demand is probably a little bit greater than it was in 2019, which to me is a positive. And I think the other thing is we opened up a lot of new bike riders during the pandemic, and now it's our responsibility to keep those people in our ecosystem and keep them riding bikes. And so, and I think some people are doing a pretty good job with that. Some people maybe a little less so.
We've talked a lot about manufacturing the frame, wheels, putting it all together, having the factory to run all that. Talk to me a bit about logistics and getting those products to the market.
Yeah, well, I think as we were saying before, in the case, say we are a factor and we sell to our Spanish distributor, and our Spanish distributor will, pick up the product at our Taiwan facility. They will then ship it by air or by sea to Spain. So, they will have a cost of either roughly $200 per unit or, 40 or 50 US dollars per unit, depending on how they ship it. They then have an import cost of, on a complete bicycle, I believe it's 11% into Europe. I think it's 4% on frame set, wheel set, something like that. Don't quote me on those per se, but there's definitely.
You're quoting yourself. You're on a podcast.
Yeah, there's definitely cost. They're not entering those countries for free. Yeah. Obviously, there's VAT, but the VAT gets passed along to the customer.
Yes.
But these are all part of their so shipping costs, tax. Then they have their insurance costs. Insurance on a container is roughly $1,000 per container. And so, these are all costs that are incurred by the distributor. And these are all things, their overhead, which, they need to cover in selling the bicycle on to the retailer.
Insurance, 1,000 per container is an interesting number.
Containers disappear. It was funny. The statistic I saw is 1 out of every 100 doesn't actually make it to its destination, wow. Which to me seems like a really big number.
Yeah.
But yeah, they disappear. Some of them fall in the ocean. Some of them get stolen along the way. They've been known to get lost. So
there you have it, folks. If you want a new bike, go start searching the seafloor. Is it? I know it's going to be different. Almost every country the world over. Is it possible to put a landed cost on bikes or frames? Or
I think that you're probably looking, say, $120 and as much as $400 is the cost that's added to every bicycle or frame set for the shipping cost and importation, whether it be to North America or to Europe.
Is there any advantage, I'm thinking blocks like the EU, or the fact that the US market is so huge, or on the opposite end of things, did Brexit have any effect?
Well, I think that Brexit, it definitely, hurt those brands that were UK-based selling into Europe. We all know that. As far as the way we operate our business, we don't consolidate to Europe. We work with, 51 different countries independently around the world, and each one of those 51 has their own shipping and their own logistics and their own idiosyncrasies. Sending bikes to East Africa is a bit of a challenge. We actually don't sell any bikes in East Africa, but we have Team Amani there, and we ship them quite a few bikes, and every time it's a little bit difficult getting the bikes into the country.
Well, on that then, I guess one of the other major costs for, I don't know if it's per bike model, but certainly for the company, must be marketing and sponsorship and teams. And you mentioned Team Amani there.
Yeah.
Obviously also other teams that you're working with, and it seems to be every other week there's a new team that Factor is providing bikes to at the moment.
Well, I think that, we are a racing brand at heart. We are a bunch of bike racers and bike riders in our company, and we like supporting, different teams, whether they be, at the world tour or even more, local level. Obviously, we don't give free bikes to everyone. The only teams that really get free bikes are, our world tour teams, perhaps some of our, more special athletes, such as Team Amani. But many teams actually come to us asking to buy bikes because they know we have a very fast bike, and they know that, we are open to doing something like that with them. But when you start to look at marketing and sponsorships, what they teach you in business school is that, 10% of your revenue should go towards marketing. And if it's more than that, it could lead to an unhealthy company. If it's less than that, it's hard to become a successful company. Obviously, Factor's been in the World Tour since before we ever sold a bike. So our marketing budget was far more than our revenue for many, many years. I think we're almost at the point now where our marketing budget actually makes sense based off of our revenue. If we look at a World Tour team, you're looking at spending between 3 and 5 million euro per year for that team. That's money paid to the team as well as equipment. It's important for most people to understand that, the Shimano or SRAM is really, they support very few teams. Almost every bicycle brand is actually buying the group sets that go on to the bikes in the World Tour, whether it be from Shimano or SRAM. In our case, we work with Shimano for our men's team, Israel Premier Tech, and we work with SRAM for our women's team, Human Powered Health. Then, obviously, I discussed earlier, we sell 10,000 bikes a year. So if you take that number and you divide it by, your marketing budget or just across that sponsorship, you could see that, every bicycle is going to definitely be affected by, that sponsorship payments that we're paying. It could be as a couple $100 per bicycle, is directly attributable to marketing or sponsorship.
Do you think that's a fair deal for the end customer who might look at it and go, you know what, I would prefer a cheaper bike than to see all these pros riding free bikes?
I think that consumers open to choose any bike that they like. And I think that we learn a lot from racing. We don't only support teams at the highest level. Here at the Tour Down Under, obviously we had Human Powered Health, but we had 2 other women's teams that we supported, both with, free bicycles. So we look at, we really want to do what's right for cycling, and promoting, racing at every different level. And we think as a brand, that's our responsibility and the right thing to do. But obviously that adds cost to our bikes. We are not the most expensive though. And when you start to look at other brands in our same vicinity and see how the sponsorship they do, in many cases, I believe it's quite a bit less.
Okay. You've already answered the question, but I want to ask it again anyway. Does that bring value to Factor? And maybe a better way to ask that question is, could you survive if you weren't in the World Tour?
I don't think we could sell as many bikes as we do if we were not in the World Tour.
Okay. And is it a big enough difference that the drop in sales would be more than the cost of the...
I think that if we're not in the World Tour, we can't sell as many bikes as we do. And if we can't sell as many bikes as we do, then we can't then support other more charitable things that we do. So whether it be, as I was saying, having multiple, second and third level teams or some of the other charities that we support with our brand, we just wouldn't have the scale to be able to do that.
I think that's an interesting one. I'm sure it causes many sleepless nights, does it?
It's a big check to write. And there's really no way of truly understanding, the return on investment. But we think that you have to be racing at the highest level, working with the best athletes to be making the highest level products.
We see also, the racing teams, it's sort of a race on Sunday, sell on Monday, that old mantra from motorsport. Does it matter how successful your team is?
I think it's really unfortunate, but the Tour de France probably makes up more than 50% of the entire value of being in the World Tour. I think the Tour de France, it's really important to be present. And then I think any results are really icing on the cake. But being present is really the most important thing. I think there's 17 or 18 brands present. So there's not that many brands present. And then when you look at those brands, most of them are brands that are selling, very, very wide range of bicycles. There's just a couple of us that are, premium racing brands.
Presumably the teams are pressing you for faster and faster equipment, which maybe speeds up the product life cycle, does it? And that would then, you're sooner having to launch a newer bike than perhaps you would otherwise. Would that be accurate?
I would say the teams are definitely the driver of innovation. They are always absolutely pushing faster, lighter, stronger, different functionality. Things are definitely becoming a little more, specific use products. We had our O2 VAM that we launched at the Tour de France last year, which we called an aero climbing bike. We have our Ostro. I wouldn't be surprised if we're starting to see the Ostro gravel raced at Paris-Roubaix in this year. And then obviously we have our Hanzo TT bike, which it's only 2 years old, but we're already being asked to, we're seeing a lot more hills in time trials. Perhaps we need to have something a little less aero, but a little lighter weight to sort of compensate for that, because time trials are becoming a lot more difficult parkour, whether it be adding climbs, adding a lot more turns, things like that. So.
We sat in this room last night as you presented the new Oz Cycling track pursuit bike for the upcoming Olympics in Paris. That sort of development cycle, that sort of product, is that presumably that doesn't even fall into the category of time trial bikes we mentioned earlier. That's
we've signed an agreement with Australian Cycling for the 2024 and 2028 Olympics to first supply their pursuit bikes for 2024, and then their mass start, track bikes for 2028, as well as the pursuit bikes for 2028. If we look at the bike that we produced for Australia, that's truly a Formula One machine. It's no different than, we see, Mercedes, racing Formula One. It's not a bike that's really anyone is ever going to go buy a Formula One, but it's a very specific use product. But that bicycle really is just a showcase of our technology, what we're capable of, and, how far we can sort of push the rules and push the limits of what's possible aerodynamically.
I'm thinking of other brands who have made Olympic bikes, say for Tokyo Cycle, but don't even make a consumer offering, technically speaking, UCI's commercialization rule and all that. You may be able to technically buy these things. What I'm sort of trying to tie this back to is the whole sponsorship and marketing aspect of it. And you said that's a demonstration of your engineering ability. Is there a world where a project like that could replace a World Tour project? Presumably it would be less cost intensive and may then see a reduction in bike prices.
I don't really think so. I mean, obviously the Olympics are just raced once a year, and this is obviously also a track bike. It's not a road bike. And so, it's not used at the same scale, as many days a year as you would see a road bike used. Currently, quite honestly, it's priced at a place where nobody could afford to buy one, but it's commercially available. And, I'm taking orders if anyone wants one.
Yeah, if the 6 numbers come up, we may have a conversation, but very, very unlikely. The influencer space is growing all the time. Is that as valuable as a World Tour team these days, and what kind of costs come with it?
We're not really big on influencers. We don't have any paid ambassadors or anything like that. We do have we have a few ambassadors that we might provide a bicycle to, but we think that, there are people that are helping to get more people riding bikes. And that's really our ultimate goal is, to get people, to enjoy the products that we make. And even if they don't buy a Factor, to just go buy a bike. And so, that's how we sort of look at ambassadors. When we look at social media marketing, however, yes, that's become a very significant expense that didn't exist. But in many ways, that's what's been the downfall, I think, of other media. Why we're not seeing print media or even, online media, because, we're spending all of that money basically on performance marketing, which is, Instagram, Google, Facebook, Twitter, things of that nature. And it's a significant expense. And, there's a few people in the company that are dedicated to that.
That sort of gets me to the final question I have on marketing, and that is, there will be people listening to this podcast thinking that this is just a chance for Factor Bikes to justify how much their bikes cost, and Escape Collective is providing that opportunity. You've obviously got a new Ostro coming. There will be media events based around that. I don't know what you're planning in terms of bringing tech writers and tech editors like myself to different locations to test the bike and all that, but how much does it typically cost to launch a bike, And like, I'm even going to go as far as asking you, because I know it doesn't happen here, but are you paying for bike reviews elsewhere? Is that something that happens?
Well, we don't pay for bike reviews. We essentially, with any bike, we sort of decide how many outlets we want to send bikes to. It's generally around 10 bikes where we'll send to people like yourself to review the bike, at your own pace. Without, really any influence from us. We don't fly people in and no junkets, anything like that. And so I think our reviews are pretty genuine. So, there's 10 bikes. We hope that those 10 bikes will be shared across 2 journalists. So once it's used by what we call tier 1 media, they then go down to tier 2 media. And so, over the course of the year, we hope to get around 20 reviews of those bikes out. I think that we budget around $50,000 for that.
Yeah, we've. I don't think we've bashed heads on that previously, but certainly getting managing the expectations of sort of what's called embargo day reviews with how long we get with a bike is something that certainly gets discussed at length.
Yeah, I think that it gets harder and harder because we want our racing teams to be using the products. And as I was saying, the guys are racing so much now or just seen riding that it becomes really difficult to keep things under wraps for too long. So, we don't want, to put too much pressure on, having an embargo, or blowing through an embargo, I should say. But, we try to manage everyone's expectations, which means that, from the time the bike is seen in the wild to actually be able to buy it, we hope that it's just a couple of months. I see some brands, get caught out, 6-8 months of, someone's seen it and then they can't buy it for a very extended period of time. I don't think that's a healthy way of the brand to be doing business.
Is that my fault or is it the brand's fault?
I would say that's the brand's fault.
Okay. There is a new Ostro coming. There is an existing Ostro. Presumably, I go on your website, you can still buy an existing Ostro. That means you've got stock, if I'm putting 2 and 2 together correctly, and that stock is about to become, I don't think obsolete is the right term, is it? Well,
no, it's definitely, it's still one of the best bikes in the world, whether it be, the one we made 4 years ago or the one we're going to be releasing soon. Yeah, of course, we have a little bit of inventory.
What I kind of just wanted to ask was how much of that then are you having to write off, and how much is that? And where I'm eventually getting to is that existing Ostro is about to be phased out. Can you give us an indication of how much those bikes average out at or something?
Well, I think, again, that's a cost of doing business. So obviously, when you're launching a new product, you will have, some product that becomes obsolete. And then it's up to you to decide, what's the best way to do it. Some companies discount it. Some companies might throw it away, although I don't know any. In our case, we try to sponsor as many youth teams as we can with those bikes. But we definitely, we're not a company that we don't discount product, and we want to, continue to support up and coming athletes. So, we will see, if there's a way of using those bikes that are now obsolete to support them.
And as we speak, every kid listening to this podcast is sending you an email looking for a new bike. So good luck with that one. Okay, I think you've given us, certainly I've learned a lot in this podcast. Certainly you've given us a lot of figures there that I wasn't aware of. Are there any other costs associated with making a premium carbon road bike that I haven't touched on here, simply because I don't know about them?
Well, I think there's lots of costs in running a brand. And I think that, there's things from, software, insurance, benefits for employees. And obviously some companies are a lot more generous than others. I like to think that we're one of the more generous companies. Everyone who runs a business, large or small, understands that, the goal of running a business is to make a profit. But I think that there's this perception in our industry that somehow, these bicycles are very expensive and everyone's making a lot of money. And I would say that, I'm not complaining about the level of the business that we have. I'm quite content, but nobody's, driving around in supercars or, flying around in Learjets at any turn in the road.
I guess the question then is, are bikes expensive? If we can wrap it all up, the consumer and a lot of us clearly think that prices are getting exceedingly expensive.
I think things are getting expensive, but I think everything in the world is getting expensive. Everything in the world is increasing in price. I think that somehow there's this feeling about bicycles that somehow they shouldn't, and I'm not really sure where it comes from. I do think that there becomes sort of like this correlation between a premium bicycle and a motorcycle. And in some ways, they're very comparable in price. But you got to remember that motorcycles, there's far less brands, and they're producing, much, much greater quantities of product, which is helping them to drive the prices down. And quite honestly, the engineering going into either is quite comparable.
Am I reading you right in saying that it's not actually possible to put a dollar figure on how much it costs to make one of these bikes? Because, or can you put a dollar figure on it?
I think every brand can put a dollar figure on their particular cost, but I certainly, I'm not going to completely expose, what is our cost. I could say it is one of the highest in the industry, but we're certainly not selling our bikes for the highest in the industry. But I think we're actually providing the most value in the bike that we give. But I would say that, every brand, it's up to them the way they wish to run their business. And it's up to the consumer to decide, what bicycle they want. If you don't want to buy a bike that's being raced in the World Tour, is there that much savings or not? I couldn't tell you.
Looking further ahead now, we've already talked about sort of some of the COVID impact. If I remember right from the start of this podcast, you suggested that we may well see another. We've been through a boom. We seem to be in a bust. We might hit another boom bust cycle. Do you think? Or
I certainly, just being here at the Tour Down Under, I've been speaking to a few friends from different manufacturers, and it does seem like people feel like we're starting to move forward and get into a better place than the industry was over the last few months. I really just hope that everybody, kind of keeps their cool, maybe thinks things through a little bit better. I think a lot of what our industry's gone through has been self-inflicted, and I think that we could do a better job moving forward.
Can you give us an insight into your forecasting for next year?
We're looking, to continue to grow our business. As I said, I think we're a little bit of an anomaly, but we're not very big, so it's not that difficult to grow when you're our size.
Forgive me if this is a stupid question, because I don't run a carbon fiber manufacturing factory, but it seems to me that if you've already invested in everything we've just talked about, you've got the raw material sitting on site, you've got the molds made, the only way to turn that into income is to manufacture the frames and as such, contract these employees.
That's correct. So I think that was one of our main differences leading into COVID is I don't believe in laying people off. And so I had my factories, I had the material, I had the people. And so I just told everybody, just keep working. And we just continued to make bikes as if there was demand. And thankfully, in just a couple of months' time, demand, turned around and we were in a good position. I think that we continue to manufacture along those same lines. I think where a lot of mistakes are made is product managers, or sales guys, they'll perhaps say, well, we're gonna, sell 1,000 of these this year. And the brand manager will then order 1,100 of these. And then the purchasing will order 1,200. And then, by the time it actually gets to the factory, they've ordered 30% more than somebody thought they could actually sell, and runs into some trouble that way sometimes.
Presumably they're making decisions though based on, especially when they scaled back ahead of COVID, and then the demand was greater than the supply. They're making those decisions because they have to protect the businesses. They are much better positioned to realize that they need to turn raw materials into product to make income than I am.
I think that the challenge at the moment is there's a lot of very full warehouses. Now's a great time to buy a bicycle, no question, because there's still a lot of discounted product out there. And until that all clears the system, it's going to make it a little bit difficult for everybody to be able to really, truly make a plan for how to move forward. So the sooner, that the market normalizes and we work through all that inventory, then the sooner we can get back to business as usual.
Well, I think the one thing everybody in the bike industry and cyclists in general can agree on is that we want this sport to grow. So hopefully we get to that place sooner rather than later.
I think we're there.
All right. Well, that's a close on the episode and chat with Rob Gitelis. Once again, thanks to Rob for, I guess, being so transparent on a topic that very few would be willing to talk about. Ronan, you got some information there that I wasn't quite expecting you to get. Any things in that chat that had you a little bit surprised?
I mean, pretty much any time Rob gives a dollar figure, I was left sort of surprised, trying to keep focus on the job at hand, which was to think of what the next question was going to be and keep the interview on track. So that was a very stressful hour for myself. Definitely thank you to Rob for being so open. We did have to give him a couple of days to get sort of figures and facts and that together. And what he came back with was, it was certainly the most insight that I've ever had into how much it does cost to make these frames. You know, we often hear the figures bandied about like $100, $200 or whatever for a frame. And Rob was actually pretty forthcoming in saying a factor frame, you know, in terms of raw materials, it's just under $400. And you're kind of wondering, well, how do you get from $400 to $5,000 for a frame? And I think, you know, Rob give plenty of reasons why or how we do end up going from that figure to the other. And you know, that, as he explained, that $400 only includes materials and the preform, the EPS styrofoam adapting latex that they use in manufacturing the frame. But then you've got, what did he say, like $100,000 to $130,000 on molds. Then what when you think about a mold, you think about the frame. But what actually I hadn't considered was that also there's a mold for the fork, which is another $6,000. He said he was putting like $150,000 aside for mold development alone, and then he went into other things like, you know, some of the R&D and the 5 engineers that they have and how CFD is becoming more prominent. But thankfully, the price of that has come down to, like, I think they said they're paying like $600 a month for that. But things like the wind tunnel are costing them up to $100,000 per new bike, which is just, you know, that's as much as we all like the gains, $100,000 is a lot to be spending that ultimately we end up paying for ourselves then.
And I guess it's worth considering that Factor's not the biggest brand. I mean, they're selling quite a number of these bikes, but they're not selling anywhere near the likes of, you know, the top 5 brands, the Specialized, the Trek, the Giant, the Cannondales. So I mean, their costs are only diluted between so many sales, and I guess that's reflected in the pricing. And what's surprising is, despite the, I guess, not being able to absorb those costs as much, is that you still end up with a bike that's competitive on price. So different business models at play there, but dare I say that, you know, Factor could potentially be selling their bikes for less if they were making a lot more of them.
If they were making a lot more of them, or the other question I had for Rob was, if you weren't committing so much to sort of marketing and sponsorship, would that help bring down the price for the end user without the sort of cost to performance or whatever the knock-on effect might be? And he was fairly adamant that, you know, they need the World Tour team to be able to sell as many bikes as they do. And the answer I got from him was that they couldn't do as much of the support work they do for other teams and sort of, you know, teams that you don't see outside the World Tour. They couldn't do as much of that support if they didn't sell as many bikes that they do sell because they support a World Tour team. What I wanted to know, would there be like a knock-on effect for performance if they didn't sponsor a World Tour team?
Hard one to answer.
A very, very difficult one to answer. But you know, when you hear them explain that they're putting between 3 and 5 million into a World Tour team, between expenditure in terms of giving the team cash, but then also like buying group sets and providing frames and wheels and that. Yeah, it's
a huge commitment for a brand that's making 10,000 bikes a year.
Yeah, and as he said, it's a couple of $100 per bike on marketing. If we go to the upper end of that $5 million that he said, you could be between 3 and 5 for a World Tour team. If we say 5 and we take a 10,000 bikes, well, that's $500 per bike. So I don't know if it's fair to make that calculation that way or not, but it's certainly a hefty chunk of what's going into the bikes. And to be fair, other bikes have disappeared from, or other brands have disappeared from the World Tour, and they have really suffered. Like Bianchi springs to mind.
Yes.
I think there is definitely a case to be made for being associated with a World Tour team.
Yeah, I think for a brand that considers itself specifically a performance racing brand, I feel like Rob is right in that you kind of need to be at that top level and you need to be having that expense at that top level. What I would push back on, and this is where I think you could say Rob is undeniably a passion-fueled owner of the business, is in how many other teams he sponsors that probably don't give all that much of a return. Like it really was, you and I were having a bit of a laugh at like, it felt like a quarter of the women's peloton at the Tour Down Under were on Factor, and I think only one of those from memory is a World Tour team, Human Powered Health.
I think even broader than that,
team.
Standing in Adelaide if you didn't know the Factor brand and someone told you, oh, they're from Adelaide, you would say, well, that makes sense because you just cannot escape Factor here in Adelaide. They had a big presence, obviously one team in the men's race, but multiple teams in the women's race, and just a lot of other Factor stuff around, all over the place, which I mean ultimately meant that this podcast could happen. So
and in our preliminary chat, working out what we're gonna basically the topics that he was gonna cover with us, and surprisingly it was everything, but in that conversation I think he had made some comment along the lines of, you have to support the lower tiers of cycling because otherwise the sport doesn't work. I honestly haven't heard that from many other brands, and there aren't many other brands that do invest through the multiple levels of cycling and in quite the way. So, I guess just props to Factor on that.
Yeah, he also mentioned, and I think he kind of got halfway through the comment and then thought I better reverse a little bit here. He said something along the lines of, in business school, they'll teach you that 10% of your revenue should be diverted to marketing. More than that, and it's not really sustainable. Less than that, you can never become a big player. And then he pointed out that Factor had been sponsoring a World Tour team since before they'd sold a bike, that they're almost at the point where their marketing budget makes sense. So I think I think that's obviously that does add cost to the bikes that we're buying in shops, but I think that's commendable on Factor's behalf, and I'm trying to make that as a positive point, not as a slight against them.
Yeah, I guess. But I guess to wrap it up, I mean the main takeaway from this episode is that what Rob has shared is incredibly relevant to a number of what I'd say are mid-tier performance brands. The brand's probably making between 5,000 to 20,000 bikes a year. Bigger brands don't disclose how many units they're doing in their race bikes. We can assume it's more than that, potentially. But yeah, I think the numbers at play there are probably a different story again. I don't think the numbers Rob have shared are something that you could necessarily replicate for every single brand playing in the industry, and it certainly becomes a very different equation for the Giant Bicycles, the Merida, the Treks of the world, who are playing in a much broader space across multiple disciplines and multiple price points. Factors at a very tip of the price scale, and their costs and all that are in house, and they have a very good idea of what their bikes cost to make, but. I think there's contract manufacturing and price tiers, and I think you'll find production costs can be a lot lower than what Rob was sharing.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because as Rob, I think, if memory serves me right now, he pointed out right at the very beginning of the interview that if you take the other top 5 players, or you take the top 5 players in the industry, Giant obviously own their own factory, Merida do. I'm not sure where Factor sit in terms of like top 5, top 10, whatever. But a lot of the top 5 manufacturers are using third-party manufacturers. A lot of the top 5 brands are using third-party manufacturers. Yeah. And then at some other point during the episode, he had mentioned that if you take the $350 to $400 figure that he had given us for materials for mid-range bikes and that, or other frames with less exotic materials, you could be looking at half of that. So the numbers we got are incredibly insightful, and again, thanks to Rob for sharing them. I would sort of warn that we shouldn't just extrapolate them out, apply them to other brands, and think that we're getting we can't even apply them to a range of frames from a single brand, because even as Rob said, things like time trial bikes and track bikes don't really make sense. I think the figure he gave was it's around 1,000 frames before the development of that frame breaks even. Have I made sense there? Basically, you need to sell 1,000 frames before you break even on all the development work you did to make that frame.
Sure.
And so there's there are things like time trial bikes. I don't know what the numbers would be like, but it probably isn't really much above 1,000 if it is above 1,000 frames per annum.
Yeah, for sure. I guess, the other point that sways it is a lot of other bike companies that are probably Factor's size in terms of units sold probably aren't investing in the sport or in R&D to the level that Factor are. So I think some of the costs he mentioned are probably not found in other businesses of relatable size in terms of, just purely in terms of units sold. I know there's a lot of companies outside of, say, the top 5 or top 10 bike companies in the world that would outsource and have contract designers, contract engineers, contract aerodynamic engineers if they're going that far, or at least CFD. They don't normally have that sort of in-house capability, whereas I guess Factor's kind of unique for their size and that they do.
I think I'll wrap us up just by saying, if you are listening to this and you do work for another brand, or perhaps worked for another brand recently, and you want to give us an insight on a similar level, by all means, get in touch with us. This is not a Factor-only gig. We will happily delve into this with any number of brands, manufacturers, factories, whoever you are, if you're listening and can provide that sort of insight and can verify it. We've verified as much as we could with Rob, but he is also the CEO of that company. So it was straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Yeah. And if you want us to jumble your voice so you can't be identified, that could be fun as well. Ronan's just nodding, even though he's disagreeing with me on that one.
No, I'm just thinking that this started off just to be a written piece. It turned into a podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well done, Ronan.
Thank
you, Rob. I guess to remind everyone, this was a special episode of Geek Warning. Normally, our special episodes are only available in full to our members, because without our members, Escape Collective wouldn't exist. We did leave this one fully open, fully free to all. So if you like this episode, please consider sharing it with your riding friends, with anyone who may find this episode interesting. And also, please consider joining if you haven't already. Anything to add, Ronan?
Just that if you don't join and I have to find a real job, I cannot make podcasts like this. So join now, or you'll have to not hear me anymore.
Yeah. Ronan previously threatened that he'd pack your bags at Tesco's.
Don't know where that came from, but...
Yeah, I don't know. It still sounds lovely. It still sounds like a lovely option to me.
All our grocery markets are available.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you, and hope you enjoyed it.
Grocery markets? Are they not called supermarkets? I think they're called supermarkets.
Yeah.
Anyway, see ya.